Imagine living in a society where you aren't allowed to participate, where the rules don't apply to you the same way that they apply to everybody else. You, your friends, your family, and your neighbors shut out of opportunities, denied basic rights, and constantly reminded that you don't belong. So what do? You build your own community, a place where you can thrive, where your businesses can flourish, where your children can get educated, and where you can create wealth for you and your family. Because in this space, you are free. Now, imagine that without warning, a mob of people storm into your town and they burn your businesses, destroy your homes, murder your neighbors, leaving bodies in the street, everything you built, everything you worked for, all of that wealth that you were creating for your children, gone overnight. And when you try to rebuild it somewhere else, you find that the laws that kept you from entering society in the first place are still there. So this isn't just an imagine. This actually happened in America. And in honor of Black History Month, the last day of Black History Month, I'm going to tell the story of just a few of the times that Black Americans, unable to create or live or build within white society, built their own communities just to see them destroyed time and time again. The Wilmington Massacre in 1898 was the first and only successful coup in American history. At the end of the 19th century, Wilmington, North Carolina had a multiracial government who were democratically elected by their citizens. It was a sign of what America could be, but the white supremacists were not having it. On November 10th, 1898, a white mob launched a violent coup overthrowing the democratically elected government. They burned Black businesses, killed dozens, actually hundreds of Black residents, and forced Black officials to resign at gunpoint. They then rewrote the laws to ensure that Black people could not hold political power again. This wasn't just a massacre, it was a political strategy. This happened again, the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, the destruction of Black Wall Street. Greenwood, Oklahoma, better known for Black Wall Street, was one of the wealthiest Black communities in the country. Businesses were booming, Black families were creating generational wealth. Then, in May 1921, a white mob descended on the town. They looted, burned, and bombed Greenwood. Flew over, dropping bombs. By the time it was over, 300 people were murdered, 35 city blocks were destroyed, and 10,000 Black residents were left homeless. Black families did try to rebuild, but they were not allowed to file insurance claims. Their wealth was stolen, their land taken, and then just like Wilmington, the government let it happen. The final one I'd like to bring your attention to is the Rosewood Massacre in 1923, a town erased over a lie. In January 1923, in Rosewood, Florida, a white woman falsely accused a Black man of assaulting her, and that's all it took. A mob of white men burned Rosewood to the ground. Black residents were hunted, lynched, forced to flee. The survivors never returned. The town was wiped off the map, and this is just three of many, many, many dozens and dozens of examples of where the government did nothing or contributed to taking and stealing land from African American families. The other reason it matters is because when people talk about racial wealth, the racial wealth gap, this is a major reason why. All of these heinous things happened against the backdrop of Jim Crow law. By the late 19th century, Jim Crow laws were enforced across the South. These laws enforced segregation in every aspect of life: schools, businesses, transportation, water fountains. And these laws weren't just about separation, they were about control. They were about oppression. They were about economic suppression. Black Americans were denied voting rights. They were denied access to quality education, denied the ability to accumulate generational wealth through home ownership and fair wages. These weren't just underwritten social rules. They were backed by courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. The court upheld segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal, reinforcing the idea that Black citizens could legally be treated as second-class citizens for decades. But it's really important to note that these laws, this is an ancient history. Jim Crow laws didn't officially end until 1964. But even after the Civil Rights Act was passed, many of these discriminatory systems remained in place. And these events were not part of an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of racial violence aimed at suppressing Black advancements. And while Black communities faced overt violence, other marginalized groups also endured systemic oppression. Women, until the 1960s, faced significant discrimination in America. Many banks required a male co-signer for women to open a bank account or obtain a credit card. Immigrants and religious minorities faced various laws and societal prejudices that were targeted directly towards non-Christian religious groups, subjecting them to discrimination and exclusion and sometimes outright violence. These patterns of discrimination reveal a common strategy, targeting one group to set up a precedent for broader societal control. So a lot of people don't understand the 60s and 70s, and they argue that historical injustices such as slavery and segregation are events of the past, and that African Americans now have the same rights, and they question the necessity for ongoing discussions about racial inequality. And yes, technically, Jim Crow laws did officially end after the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, but that didn't mean racism disappeared overnight. Schools in the South resisted integration for years. Black Americans still faced housing discrimination, and voter suppression tactics, they continue today. These laws didn't fully take hold well into the 1970s. And what changed? People came together. The 1960s saw Black Americans, white Americans, women, men coming together, fighting against oppression like never before. And the media played a crucial role in shifting the public perception. For the first time, Americans saw the brutal realities of racism broadcasted directly into their living rooms. Black children murdered in a house of God because a white supremacist put a bomb in there. Peaceful marchers beaten in Selma. Fire hoses turned on crowds. The terror of white moms resisting desegregation. The ugliness of racism. And this backlash brought desegregation. And that was the media. That was the journalists of that time. They did that. There's absolutely no question in my mind why there has been a target on the media. There has been a messaging campaign to make them irrelevant because they truly are the change makers. They bring the information to the people to change public perception. And that is why, by the late 1970s, as the civil rights movement and the women's right gained momentum, a powerful conservative backlash was forming. In 1971, Lewis Powell's The Powell Memo laid out a plan for corporations and conservative leaders to push back against progressive movements. This strategy gave rise to think tanks, lobbying groups, and judicial influence that would shape conservative politics for decades. But the most important thing that we need to know out of that movement, out of the Powell Memo, is where Project 2025 was conceived. Project 2025 is a modern blueprint to roll back civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, and dismantle the federal protections for education and racial equality. It's not by coincidence that Project 2025 emerged in 1979 in response to a time when people were beginning to unite against oppression. This concerted effort attacked these progressive movements, especially the African American community. They attacked them on all fronts. Despite the fact that African Americans make up 13% of the population, they make up almost 40% of the prisons. Studies have shown that Black drivers are more likely to be stopped by police, and Black individuals often receive longer sentences than their white counterparts for the same offenses. In 1980s, the war on drugs, this disproportionately targeted Black communities, leading to mass incarceration and destabilized families. Policies like mandatory minimum sentences removed judicial discretion, resulting in excessively harsh penalties for nonviolent offenses. This predominantly affected people of color. And as most of us know, education is the great equalizer. Yet access to quality education remains unequal to this day. Schools in affluent areas receive more funding due to property tax-based financing, while those in economically disadvantaged communities, often communities of color, struggle with fewer resources. This disparity limits opportunities and perpetuates cycles of poverty and marginalization. And by the way, how many of us pay taxes that go to schools that don't have children? This should be a no-brainer. All schools that are funded by the federal government should receive the same funding and be a baseline of equality. But this is one of the reasons why they want to dismantle the Department of Education, because investing in equitable education isn't just a moral imperative, it benefits all of society. A well-educated country, it drives innovation, it boosts the economy, and it fosters a more engaged community. But the history of Jim Crow, the racial violence, the civil rights, it isn't just about the past. It's about the present. The systems built to suppress Black Americans didn't just disappear, they evolved. Mass incarcerations, voter suppression, attacks on DEI programs, and efforts to rewrite history are all part of the same legacy. We need so much to recognize the patterns, because history, it doesn't just repeat itself, it evolves. It gets smarter, it gets technology, it gets AI. So if we don't fight back, it will happen again. And the more we understand it, the harder it is for them to erase it. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe.